Welcome to the Governance Podcast at the Centre for the Study of Governance and Society at King's College London. I'm Hanna Kleider from the Department of Political Economy, and today I will be talking to Professor Jenna Bednar, who is Professor of Political Science at the University of Michigan and Research Professor at the Institute for Social Research. Her research focuses on the theoretical underpinnings of the stability of federal states. Her most recent book, The Robust Federation, demonstrates how complementary institutions maintain and adjust the distribution of authority between national and state governments. Her book was recently recognized by the APSA with the Martha Durthik Best Book Award for its lasting contribution to the study of federalism. Thank you so much for joining us today, Jenna.
Hanna, it's a great pleasure to be here.
Great. So I wanted to start with a policy-relevant question about the usefulness of federalism. So the topic of federalism has gained a lot of attention, not only by academics, but also by international institutions and policymakers more generally, that often recommend federalism as a solution to a number of issues in conflict-ridden and heterogeneous societies. So what do you think makes federalism so attractive in these contexts?
I think that especially in cases where there's a diverse society that is clustered geographically, right, where people intuitively think about federalism, and the reason why they think about federalism for these societies as a system of governance is because if these diverse clusters of people have different goals or different preferences than others, then you can decentralize policymaking authority, let them set policy according to their own preferences. And so in a sense that might diffuse some tension that otherwise would have to be managed by the central government. But
in a way, sort of the reasons why it makes federalism so attractive are often at the same time the reasons that sort of raise conflict and tensions in these societies. That's kind of the paradox of federalism. So do you think your theory and your work more generally can help us explain sort of recent events in Europe and beyond?
Well, you nailed it, Hanna. Maybe we can pause for a second and just think about what you called, and I love that you called it the paradox of federalism, that on the one hand, you would adopt this federal system because you're trying to diffuse this tension, but then at the same time, what you're doing is kind of recognizing the right to organize and express themselves of these differing populations. So what I like to think about are these boundaries of federalism, that is, and we're not talking about now geographical boundaries between the units, but the legal or policy-making boundaries between the national government and the regional governments, and how those boundaries are enforced, right? Because as quite naturally, the regional governments are going to try to assert themselves maybe in ways that generate externalities for other regions or push against what the national government is doing. And at the same time, the national government could encroach upon the authorities of the state government. So this is a real tension. It's, you can't just stop when you're writing a constitution with we've written down the rules, national government, you get these things to do, state government, you get these things to do. That's only the beginning of solving the
now
problem.
Behave accordingly.
Right. So now be nice. So and that's really the puzzle that the first half of the puzzle that I tried to unpack in the book that you referenced is what makes that authority boundary meaningful, that it is sharp enough that if there is encroachment or shirking, that there will be a consequence for breaking the rules, right? But at the same time, the rules themselves probably ought to change over time as societies change, as what we want or expect from our government changes. We ought to be flexible. So this is a real challenge. How do you have rules that are meaningful but at the same time flexible, right? So, so the way I worked it out in the book is to think, the natural thing you think about it was, that's fine. Well, let's let the court decide if you violated the rules, right? But that doesn't solve, raises a couple of issues. First, what if the court itself is captured either by state interests or, more likely, the national government's interests, right? So the states don't trust it. This was, if we were to talk about Canadian history, this was a real issue for the Canadians, for the Quebecois. But at the same time, who is the court as an authority to say how those rules should change over time, right? Yeah. So thinking about the court as an important umpire, a referee, if you will, of these boundaries, but maybe not the only one. Yeah. So then we want to think in terms of a set of safeguards of those boundaries, judicial, the court, but also different ways that you can structure the national government to kind of break apart majoritarian interests and encourage representation of the regional governments, even as the national government is setting policy. The people themselves, maybe, it takes an awful lot for them to rise up and say, I object to what's happening here on federalism grounds, but sometimes their objections are as if, to policy is can be expressed in terms of federalism. And the states themselves may push back against one another. I was calling it in the book intergovernmental retaliation. So this is not meant to necessarily be exhaustive of all of the kinds of safeguards that there might be, but just to encourage other scholars like you to think in terms of, we can go beyond just thinking about what the court does to manage these tensions, and that there are all kinds of safeguards in a federal system that might make those boundaries meaningful and at the same time allow us to review them and let them adjust.
That's very interesting. I really like this idea of retaliatory non-compliance by sort of the states vis-a-vis the federal government. Can you give an example, a recent example of how that would work?
Oh, yeah. There's... So as an American, there's all kinds of things that are consuming us these days. I don't know when anyone might be listening to this podcast, but currently there's an impeachment investigation that's consuming Congress, looking into the actions of our president vis-a-vis inviting foreign powers into helping him, get dirt on, if you will, his political rivals. At the same time, there's another thing going on that for people like you and me who love federalism is happening in the United States. It's kind of under the radar. And this is a war almost between Washington, the Trump administration specifically, and California. And so there are all kinds of ways that California is pushing against the federal authority as it's kind of developing new policies. And the way it's pushing against the Trump administration has made President Trump quite angry. It may have started really become most salient when they pushed against the administration's crackdown on trying to round up those who are undocumented in our country. And what the administration did was ask, but really more command, states to help the federal government's policing authorities to identify undocumented people living in the country. ICE, exactly. And California said, we are not going to have our state employees engage in that activity. The reason that they gave was that policing powers depend so much on community trust. And by doing this, you're disrupting community trust. So they said this is actually at odds with our own goals in terms of provision of these, very important services to maintain order in our society. And so we will not engage in that. And so this has been become known as sanctuary cities, right, where there are regions that have said, and the whole state of California has said, we will not participate in this. So this is a rejection of the policy, but as it's doing that, this is the retaliatory non-compliance. We disagree, and we will not participate.
Yeah, and it's been quite gutsy of California to do that.
And the reason why it's gutsy is because it doesn't end there.
Yeah.
Right? So all of our states depend on the federal government for a lot of financial support.
Yeah.
And so more and more, the federal government is using its spending powers, which has been acknowledged as a legitimate use by the Supreme Court. So using its spending powers to say, if you don't fall in line and agree to our assertion of authority, we're going to take away money.
Yeah.
So it's gutsy and it's expensive for them to do this.
And it's so interesting to see how it has turned around with the states being a safeguard against the sort of democratic federal government to now them being a safeguard against the Republican federal government.
Isn't it? Yes. Yes, it is very interesting.
And with climate change, we are seeing sort of more or less the same thing with states taking the lead.
Yeah. Exactly. So what's happening right now with the battle between the Trump administration and California over vehicle emission standards. Mm-hmm. So going actually well back in time, the earliest innovations in terms of trying to regulate factories and other sources of pollution all happened within the states. So this is going back to the 1950s and 1960s. And it happened, like in my own state of Michigan, from our public health commissioner, who said, oh my goodness, these emissions are making people very sick. Mm-hmm. So this is a public health crisis. Mm-hmm. And so what we need to do is regulate these emissions to keep people healthy. And so within the state of Michigan, long before the federal government, long before maybe 10 or 15 years before the federal government got on board, the state was innovating. California also was developing new policies to protect the health of its citizens. And in particular, in California, the concern was over particulates, right? So there's all kinds of pollutants that are generated, but in California, especially in the LA Basin. So the LA Basin is a very particular geography that interacts with the atmosphere in a way. So it's this basin that has the ocean to the west, and then it's
mountains.
Mountains, mm-hmm. Exactly. So it kind of holds in any pollution. And then there's the sun, and in chemical ways that I don't fully understand, there was a professor at Caltech who took a year off to do this research on why is the LA Basin so bad in terms of smog, right? Yeah. The smog of the LA Basin. And it had to do with the sun also, so it's this enclosed area, and then the sun in some senses just augmented this the effect of these pollutants. And so it's like a perfect storm of circumstances that made LA particularly nasty and was making people very, very sick. So when the federal government in the early 70s started regulating to protect the environment with the Clean Air Act and then the Clean Water Act, with the Clean Air Act, it gave California an exemption. So when the federal government sets a standard, according to our Constitution, it can preempt state activity in that area. They set a standard, but they allowed California to exceed that standard. So to set a policy that was even more strict. So it had this longstanding exemption. This led to all kinds of changes to vehicle standards because California was working on reducing particulates. That's the stuff coming out of tailpipes for autos. And so pushed to have the shift from leaded gasoline to unleaded gasoline, and the creation of the catalytic converter, which is a way of taking that unleaded gasoline and, again, back to chemistry, somehow creating higher octane, so more power when you were taking away the lead, all in the interest of protecting the environmental air quality in LA. Well, what happened is the rest of the country sort of had to follow California standards. Not that California was setting policy for anybody else, but because the auto manufacturers are saying, wait, California is a huge part of our market, right? And so we could make cars just for California, but that would be really expensive to have two separate production lines. So we will meet California standards everywhere. So
that's so interesting. So since we're already talking about policy experimentation, that's kind of an important part of federalism research that we think that state governments should take the lead in experimenting with new policies. So what is a good way of the federal government to nudge these regional governments into experimenting?
Yeah, exactly. So sometimes... So state experimentation is not always a good thing. We should.
That's true.
Although the talk that I'll give today is going to praise it, but because we can certainly learn an awful lot about it from state experimentation. Sometimes, though, states won't experiment. So going back to this case of California and the emission standards, everybody benefited from that because everybody's air was cleaner, thanks to California focusing in on what could be done to reduce tailpipe emissions and demanding of the auto manufacturers that they have their engineers work on that problem. So California was willing to take on that burden, but Michigan certainly wasn't doing it. I mean, this was really affecting Michigan directly. Other states weren't doing it. So sometimes what the federal government has done is offer incentives, switching gears, not thinking about clean air, but instead thinking about welfare. Okay, so for a long while, our welfare policy in the United States was AFDC, Aid to Families with Dependent Children, right? And this is a cost-sharing program where states would set some sort of standard that would create a cost for the program based upon the number of people who were in need within the state. And then the states would pay only a portion of the cost of that program, and the federal government would pay the other portion. So the amount that the states were paying, and it was a function of really how well off a state was, but we're somewhere between a third to half of the cost of the program. The rest of it was paid for by the federal government. Well, the states weren't innovating very much, right? And welfare, while we had a decline in the number of poor, sort of after the Johnson era of this Great Society program, it tapered off, right? And we weren't solving this problem of poverty, and so the federal government this is in the 1990s, and the Republicans coming in and taking control of Congress, they said, hey, let's encourage the states to innovate. Well, how are the states going to innovate? It's kind of costly to develop a new program. What we'll do is we'll shift that funding scheme from being this matching grant program to being one of block grants. So we will say to the states, if you, we're going to give you a set amount of money, and then you work out how you're going to relieve poverty. And they set some standards, minimal standards. They said, but if you figure out a welfare policy that reduces costs, then you can keep the savings. You can keep 100% of those savings. Whereas under AFDC and under these matching grants, if the states had developed some new policy, they're only keeping 30 cents, say, or maybe 50 cents of every dollar saved, right? So block grants are seen as a way to incentivize innovation, which is sometimes needed because without that target or that this kind of big prize available to the states for trying something new, they might not try.
Okay. Well, going back to your sort of more general work about the principles of federalism, you talk about sort of institutional design. You say you don't want to give one ideal sort of federal system, but you have some sort of design principles. Now, if you were to give policymakers some advice on what the key design principles are, what would you tell them?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked me that question. Because again, people want to say, "Oh, it's fine. All I have to do is have this set of safeguards, and things will be cool." Well, the safeguards are only, as a system, are only effective because everyone is imperfect, right? Like the courts could be, like as I said earlier, could be biased in favor of the federal government. There are all kinds of reasons to think that there might be imperfections, or the fragmentation at the federal government level. So in the United States, where we have a separation of powers between the executive, the judiciary, and the legislature, and then even within the legislature, it's bicameral, right? So all kinds of fragmentation going on there. But the fragmentation is only useful if there's competition, right? If there are competing ideologies, partisanships, or for federalism, competing visions about how to the extent to which we should pay attention to one region's interest versus another. If all of those branches of government at the federal level are held by the same ideology or have the same vision, then in terms of a safeguard, it's a failure, right? It's going to be very biased. So that's why we need redundancy. Then we'd want to turn to another safeguard. But what if they're all held by the same authority, right? And then that's a problem. So what we need in order to have robustness in this system is for these safeguards to fail for different reasons, right? We need independence in failure. That is, what I would make in terms of a recommendation to those who would design a system is to say, okay, what is the likelihood that these different safeguards would all be held by the same authority or someone, those who share the same vision? If that is likely, then you probably want to find yet another authority to introduce to break that apart.
That's so interesting. Actually, it sort of reminds me of an idea that was put forward by Jan Erk about sort of linguistic divisions kind of generating these different ideas to some extent. If we think about Quebec in Canada or Catalonia in Spain, And I was just wondering what you thought about this idea that if federations are linguistically homogeneous, they will tend towards centralization. If they're heterogeneous, they will tend towards decentralization. Is this something that you have observed, or is that something that you would share?
I think it's such an interesting observation of his. And, we think about what role in this argument is language playing, right? Language is like our most essential coordinating device. Right? We only come to understand one another because of language. And so those of us who share a language may for sure have some other identity characteristics that we share, right? So it may be that language is a good way of saying, aha, you who speak my language probably share my views, and those people over there who share a different language, who speak a different language, probably have a different set of ideas. So it's a great coordinating device. If you can coordinate your activities and you can have confidence that somebody shares your interests, then you're much more likely to be able to organize effectively and to resist that encroachment by the central government. So in multilingual societies, if language corresponds to the political boundaries, which it doesn't necessarily have to, but if it does, then that offers some it makes it a lot easier to organize to resist the federal government, because if it's a system where the federal government holds the purse strings, right, is in charge of most of the finances, it's really hard to defend yourself. You say, yes, I would prefer it another way. And as we were talking about before, but the federal government can say, yeah, well, fine, then you can't have any money. And but anyway, so you do need these coordinating mechanisms. I think language might play that role. Of course, we don't have that in the United States. We have language diversity, but it isn't geographically clustered.
Yeah. I mean, we don't have that in Germany either, or Austria, or Australia. And the argument is, right, that Germany has been tending towards a more centralized federation than perhaps Canada or Belgium.
Right. And I would say it's because there are other reasons to centralize. You may not need to be decentralized, right? It is a costly system. But if you had linguistic differences, it may have made that process more less likely. So I think there's a lot to be said with his observation there in the theory. It's a great one.
Okay. Well, I wanted to ask you what do you think will be your next stage? What's the next stage in your research agenda?
So we've been talking a lot about policy and about the states with having these new ideas. The talk that I'm giving today and what I'm writing on right now is kind of a pushback against the reigning way that we talk about federalism, which is what I call an allocative theory of federalism. That is, because there are these diverse interests that are geographically clustered, we devolve authority so that people can set different policies. But that's kind of an inconvenience. That's a bother, right? Like, if people weren't different, we wouldn't need to do this. We could solve things much more efficiently at the central level, right? So federalism is an inconvenience. Diversity is an inconvenience, right? What I am writing about right now is thinking about diversity as being very useful. So that as we have these diverse expressions of policy interests at the state level, and the states trying out new policies, it introduces information into the system. That is, we can learn. Thinking about California and pushing on tailpipe emissions, the rest of the country learned, and that's a really positive thing. So I can think about federalism as a way that you can I'm calling it a problem-solving mechanism, as a problem, as a way for a polity to discover new policies that it might not have thought about just at the central level, right? That you need this exploration that's happening at the state level.
Yeah, that's a very nice view of diversity. I think one that not everybody would always share.
Yeah.
But that sort of offers a very nice sort of analysis of what are the benefits of having different views.
It's exactly right.
Perfect. Well, we have a little bit more time, so I wanted to ask you, how did you become interested in this area of research?
Oh, in the diversity?
Diversity, federalism, sort of comparative institutions.
Oh, my goodness. Those are three different areas.
You can pick and choose.
It's all really good. With diversity, my husband, Scott Page, works on diversity, and he is the one who got me thinking about diversity as and diverse perspectives as improving the group problem solving. Mm-hmm. So that's his theoretical contribution. And I said, that makes a lot of sense for federalism. Now, federalism, why do I care about federalism? Yeah. This goes back to when I was an undergraduate. Although I'm on faculty at the University of Michigan now, I was an undergrad at Michigan. And federalism essentially was dead in the United States. This is the 1980s, and nothing was happening at the state level, nothing at all. But I was an intern up in the Canadian House of Commons, up in Parliament, and federalism was so alive and fascinating, right? This is of course, everything was happening with Quebec at the time, but even Western provinces were asserting themselves, resisting the kind of Ontarian dominance in the system. And so I came back to the United States and I said, I don't think federalism is dead. And I started working on it. And then, thank goodness, around the same time, the Rehnquist Court also started recognizing the significance of the states in the system. So it was a lot of luck that I got started on a topic that then became kind of policy relevant over the next decade or so. And then you asked about comparative institutions. So I, as a graduate student, spent most of my time actually in economics, maybe a little bit more than in political science. And in economics, I was fascinated with this idea that you can shape human behavior by structuring the rules, by changing the incentives, changing the information. So I studied a lot of game theory, and game theory in political science is just, that's what you do when you do comparative institutions. It's just you modify the rules a little bit and see how it changes behavior, whether it's by individuals or it's by whole populations and what they choose. Yeah. So I think it's kind of at the core of what we do as political scientists is think about, if we change the institutions that govern us, we change what we can achieve as a society.
Wow, that's a very nice ending sentence. Well, thank you very much for joining us, Jenna. I'm very much looking forward to your talk. To all our listeners, thank you for joining us on this episode of the Governance Podcast. To learn more about our upcoming podcasts and events at the Center for the Study of Governance and Society, follow us on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. In the meantime, we look forward to seeing you again soon on the Governance Podcast.